There is a distinct psychological shift that occurs when you work the night shift. When the sun disappears and the rest of the world goes to sleep, the rules of reality seem to change. The streets empty out, becoming dark and hostile. Inside, the harsh glare of fluorescent lights feels less like illumination and more like an interrogation. You are completely isolated. Every hum of a refrigerator, every settling pipe, every gust of wind against the glass sounds amplified in the dead, heavy air. You convince yourself that the locked doors and the security cameras are enough to keep the darkness out. But the true horror of the graveyard shift isn't always about someone breaking the lock. Sometimes it's the agonizing realization that you were never actually alone to begin with.
I read this first terrifying account recently on an online forum dedicated to graveyard shift workers. The poster, a guy named Mark, described his experience working as a clerk at a desolate 24-hour gas station. It was situated on a lonely stretch of highway, surrounded by dense pine forests and miles away from the nearest town. It was a Tuesday night in late October. Around 2 a.m., Mark was sitting behind the thick, bulletproof glass of the main booth. The station was incredibly quiet. Business was completely dead. The highway outside was empty, devoid of even the occasional long-haul trucker. The only sound in the entire building was the irritating electrical buzz of the neon sign above the pumps and the faint rhythmic hum of the beverage coolers behind him. The isolation was palpable. It felt heavy, pressing against the glass from the outside. Then, a dark, beat-up sedan pulled into the lot. The driver didn't pull up to the pumps nearest the store, which were brightly lit by the canopy overhead. Instead, the car slowly rolled to the very last pump, at the absolute edge of the cracked asphalt, right where the floodlights barely reached and the dark tree line began. The headlights clicked off, the engine died, but no one got out. Mark sat in his booth and watched the car. 5 minutes passed, then 10. The wind picked up, blowing dry leaves across the pavement. He assumed someone had just pulled over to sleep, which wasn't entirely uncommon on this desolate stretch of road. He went back to reading a worn-out magazine, trying to distract himself from the suffocating silence. He found himself reading the same paragraph over and over. He told himself there was nothing to worry about. The heavy steel door to the booth was locked. The glass was reinforced. He was perfectly safe in his little illuminated box. An hour passed. The air in the booth felt stale and uncomfortably cold. Around 3:15 a.m., Mark looked up from his magazine and glanced back out at the lot. The car was still parked in the exact same spot, but the driver's side door was now hanging wide open. Mark frowned. He stood up and pressed his face closer to the bulletproof glass, cupping his eyes over the interior glare. He scanned the dark parking lot. His hair on the back of his neck stood up. At the very edge of the floodlight's reach, standing perfectly still in the shadows of the tree line, was a man. The man wasn't walking toward the convenience store. He wasn't looking at his car. He was just standing there, facing the booth, staring directly at Mark. The distance and the thick shadows made it impossible to make out his facial features, but his posture was unnervingly rigid. His arms hung limply at his sides, completely motionless. He looked like a discarded mannequin abandoned in the woods. A cold wave of dread washed over Mark. His hands began to shake uncontrollably. He slowly picked up the landline phone and dialed 911, keeping his eyes locked on the figure in the dark. He whispered his location to the dispatcher, his voice cracking. The dispatcher assured him a county cruiser was already on the way. Mark hung up the phone. He took a deep, shaky breath, trying to slow his racing heart. When he looked back out the window, the shadows at the edge of the lot were empty. The man was gone. Mark breathed a heavy sigh of relief. He assumed the guy had gotten spooked by seeing him on the phone and had simply walked off into the woods to hide. He sat back down in his chair, rubbing his tired eyes with the palms of his hands. Then he heard a sound that made his blood run cold. It was a faint, wet squeaking noise, and it came from right in front of him. He looked down. The man hadn't walked into the woods. He had crossed the vast, brightly lit parking lot in total silence. He was currently crouching right outside the glass booth, just below the counter level, completely out of sight until this very second. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, the man stood up. His pale, gaunt face hovered just inches from the thick, reinforced window. His skin looked grayish under the fluorescent lights. His eyes were wide, severely bloodshot, and completely unblinking. He didn't speak, he didn't bang on the glass, he didn't demand money. He just raised a filthy, jagged fingernail to the glass. The night air outside was freezing, and the window had gathered a thin layer of condensation from the heat inside the booth. Moving with deliberate, robotic slowness, the man used his nail to draw a large, uneven smiley face in the fog. The wet squeaking of his skin against the glass echoed through the small metal speaker hole, sending violent shivers down Mark's spine. Suddenly, the red and blue lights of a police cruiser flashed in the distance, sweeping across the gas station canopy. The man's twisted smile vanished instantly. Without singing a word, he turned and sprinted across the lot with terrifying speed. He disappeared into the thick woods behind the station before the cruiser even pulled in. The police searched the area with heavy flashlights and dogs, but they found absolutely nothing. The car left at the pump turned out to be stolen. Mark handed in his keys the very next morning and never worked a night shift again.
This next story comes from a friend of a friend who works in private security. His name is David. David was assigned to the graveyard shift at a massive, closed logistics warehouse. The company had recently downsized. The building was mostly empty, waiting to be leased out to a new buyer. His job was simple, but incredibly tedious. He had to walk the perimeter, check the exterior doors, make sure the million-square-foot facility was secure from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. It was an incredibly lonely job. The warehouse was cavernous. It was filled with towering, empty racks of metal pallets. They stretched as far as the eye could see. They disappeared into the gloom. The only lighting came from dim motion sensor security bulbs. They would click on with a loud mechanical thud as he walked down the endless concrete aisles. Then they would shut off behind him, plunging his previous path into total, impenetrable darkness. His heavy footsteps would echo off the high, corrugated metal ceiling. The sound bounced around the empty space, making him feel incredibly small and entirely exposed. For the first few weeks, the routine was boring, but perfectly normal. But as November rolled in, the nights grew longer, the temperature dropped, and small, unexplainable things began to happen. David would leave a chair in the break room pulled out. He would leave it facing the table. When he came back from his hour-long round, the chair would be pushed in, or it would be turned around, facing the doorway, like someone had been sitting in it, watching the hall. Sometimes he would find empty cardboard boxes rearranged. They would be stacked differently in the deep, forgotten aisles at the very back of the building. At first, he convinced himself it was just the day shift maintenance crew. Maybe they were leaving things messy,
or perhaps his own fatigue was playing tricks on his memory. When you spend 40 hours a week in total suffocating silence, your mind tries desperately to fill in the gaps. You start second-guessing your own reality. But one night, the building was dead silent. The industrial heaters were turned off. The warehouse was absolutely freezing. David could see his own breath pluming in the air. He was walking down a narrow aisle in the far back corner of the facility. It was a section he rarely had to patrol closely. It was completely stripped of inventory, just bare metal racks and thick layers of dust. He stopped to tie his heavy work boot. He knelt down on the freezing concrete. Above him, in the oppressive silence, he heard a sound. It wasn't the building settling. It was a dry, hacking cough. David froze. His hands stopped moving over his laces. He slowly stood up. He clicked off his heavy mag-light flashlight to avoid giving away his position. He listened. He strained his ears in the dark. The sound hadn't come from the floor level. It had come from above. He clicked his flashlight back on and aimed a beam straight up toward the ceiling. Suspended about 30 feet in the air were massive industrial ventilation ducts. They ran the entire length of the warehouse. His beam caught something metallic reflecting the light. The heavy iron grate covering one of the main vents had been completely removed. It was lying flat on top of the highest tier of the pallet rack, directly below the opening. David's heart began to hammer against his ribs. It beat so loud he thought whoever was up there could hear it. He knew he should call the police immediately, but part of him needed to know if he was just being paranoid. Maybe maintenance had left it there months ago. He slowly, quietly gripped the cold steel of the pallet rack. He began to climb the metal scaffolding, pulling himself up tier by tier. The dust coated his gloves. His breathing was shallow. He climbed until he was level with the dark, gaping hole of the duct. The smell hit him before he even looked inside. It was a putrid, eye-watering mix of stale body odor, urine, and rotting food. It was the distinct smell of someone living in a very enclosed space. He aimed his flashlight beam deep into the metal tunnel. About 10 feet back, insulated from the cold of the warehouse floor, he saw a makeshift nest. There was a filthy, heavy sleeping bag, dozens of empty water bottles, a pile of fresh fast food wrappers. But that wasn't what made David's stomach drop. Pinned to the inside walls of the sheet metal duct were photographs. They were held up by strips of peeling duct tape. David pulled himself up slightly to see them clearly. His breath caught in his throat. They were Polaroid photos, and they were all photos of him. There were pictures of him sitting in the break room, eating his lunch. Pictures of him doing his rounds, the flashlight beam cutting through the dark. Pictures of him looking down on his phone near the loading docks. The angles of the photos were all pointing downwards, looking through the ceiling grates. The person hadn't just been living in the vents. They had been tracking his every move, learning his precise routine, taking pictures of him from the darkness above while he walked blindly below. David didn't make a sound. He climbed down the scaffolding as fast as he physically could. He walked straight out the front door, locked it, and called his supervisor from the safety of his car. The police later cleared the vents with dogs, but whoever had been living there had slipped out. David quit his job the next day. He still checks the ceilings whenever he enters a large room.
This final story is a personal experience shared with me by a former co-worker named Chris, back when we both worked minimum wage jobs to get by. A few years ago, Chris was working as a shift manager at a popular freestanding fast food restaurant. It was a miserable Sunday night, which meant the dining room closed at midnight and the drive-thru closed at 1 a.m. Usually, there were 3 people assigned to the closing shift to tackle the absolute mountain of cleaning required. But that night,
Both of his coworkers had called in sick with no notice. Management, in their infinite wisdom, told him to just do the best he could and close the entire store by himself. By 1:15 a.m., the restaurant was completely dead. Chris was utterly exhausted. His feet ached from 10 hours of standing on hard tile. His uniform smelled deeply of old fryer grease, and he just wanted to go to sleep. He locked the heavy glass front doors, turned off the main dining room lights, and went to the back manager's office to begin counting the cash drawers. The office was small, cramped, and windowless. It had a tiny, outdated black and white security monitor on the desk that toggled between 4 camera feeds: the dining area, the drive-through window, the front counter, and the main kitchen. In his desperate rush to finish his chores and start counting the money, Chris realized he had forgotten to do one crucial thing. He hadn't checked the heavy steel delivery door at the very back of the kitchen. Delivery drivers used it during the day, and it was supposed to be deadbolted from the inside at night. He figured it was fine. The area was quiet. He would just lock it on his way out of the building. He sat in the windowless office, counting stacks of worn, greasy bills. The restaurant was completely silent. The low, rumbling hum of the walk-in freezer was the only background noise. Then the heavy silence was broken. Beep, hiss. It was the distinct electronic chime of the deep fryers turning on, followed immediately by the sound of hot oil starting to bubble and pop. Chris froze, his hand still holding a thick stack of $20 bills. He knew for an absolute fact that he had turned the fryers off, drained them, and scrubbed them over an hour ago. Industrial fryers don't just turn themselves back on. He slowly looked up at the black and white security monitor on his desk. He waited for the camera feed to cycle to the kitchen view. When the grainy image finally appeared on the screen, Chris felt the blood drain entirely from his face. A cold sweat broke out on his forehead. Standing in the exact center of the dark stainless steel kitchen was a person. They were wearing a dark, oversized hoodie pulled up over their head and a cheap, smooth plastic mask that obscured their entire face. It looked like a blank theatrical mask, devoid of any expression or humanity. They weren't moving toward the cash registers in the front. They weren't rummaging through the walk-in freezer for food. They weren't looking for the safe. They were just standing, perfectly still, their body angled directly toward the dark hallway that led to the manager's office. In their right hand, catching the faint, eerie glow of the digital fryer display, was a long, heavy kitchen knife. They had pulled it from the magnetic strip above the prep station. They had come in through the unlocked back door, and they weren't there to rob the place. They had turned the fryers on as a lure. They were just waiting for Chris to walk out of the office to investigate the noise. Chris didn't make a sound. He didn't even breathe. He slowly reached up, his hand trembling violently, and twisted the deadbolt on the office door from the inside. Click. He slid off his chair, crawling under the desk, and pulled his cell phone from his pocket. He dialed 911, covering his mouth with his hand to muffle his voice as he frantically whispered the address to the dispatcher. For 15 agonizing minutes, Chris sat huddled in the dark under the desk, staring up at the security monitor. The masked figure never moved an inch. They just stood there, completely motionless, staring down the hallway, waiting for the door to open. When the wail of police sirens finally echoed from the highway outside, the figure slowly turned their head toward the front of the store. Without rushing, they walked out the back delivery door and disappeared into the night. The police scoured the area, deploying a canine unit into the surrounding woods, but they never found the person in the mask. Chris handed his manager his keys the very next morning. He never worked in food service again.